The year is 1980. Deep inside the hardened command bunker of the PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the mood is one of absolute comfortable confidence. These men are the guardians of the Kremlin skies. They oversee the most complex, expensive, and dense air defense network in the history of mankind. It is a ring of steel that stretches from the freezing Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. A Soviet general staring at the glowing map of the motherland traces the lines of defense with pride. He sees thousands of Su 300 missile batteries. He sees regiments of MiG-31 Foxhound interceptors patrolling the edge of space. He sees a radar network so powerful it can detect a basketball floating in orbit. To the Soviet mind, the concept of a penetrating bomber is dead. They believe that physics is on their side. A large aircraft made of metal reflects radar waves. It is a law of nature. Therefore, if the Americans try to send their B-52s or their B-1s into this fortress, they will be slaughtered. The Soviet general smiles. He believes he has checkmated the U.S. Air Force. He believes the sky is closed, but he is wrong. At that very moment, halfway around the world, inside a windowless hangar in Palmdale, California, a group of engineers at Northrop are rewriting the laws of physics. They are building a machine that defies every convention of aeronautical design. It has no tail. It has no fuselage. It looks like a boomerang made of black obsidian. It looks like something that crashed in Roswell. They are building the B-2 Spirit. And when it is finished, it will turn the Soviet Union's billion-dollar radar network into $1 billion worth of junk. To understand the magnitude of this technological leap, we must first understand the obsession of the Soviet Union. Since the end of World War II, the USSR had been traumatized by the threat of American bombers. They remembered the destruction of German cities. They knew that the United States Strategic Air Command could deliver nuclear weapons to any point on the globe. So they invested everything in defense. They built radars that operated on every frequency. They built missiles that could fly at Mach 6. They turned the sky into a mathematical grid of death. The American response for decades had been speed and altitude. They built the B-58 Hustler to fly fast. They built the B-70 Valkyrie to fly high. But by the 1970s, the Soviet missiles had become too good. Speed was no longer enough. Altitude was a suicide pact. The shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 spy plane proved that the Soviets could reach the edge of space. The U.S. Air Force realized they needed a new philosophy. They didn't need to outrun the missile. They needed to hide from the radar that guided it. They needed stealth. The F-117 Nighthawk was the first step. It was a small tactical fighter, but the B-2 was a different beast entirely. The Air Force wanted a heavy bomber, a plane that could carry 20 tons of nuclear weapons, a plane that could fly from Missouri to Moscow and back without refueling, a plane that was massive yet invisible. The engineers at Northrop went back to the drawing board of history. They looked at the designs of Jack Northrop, a visionary genius who had been obsessed with the concept of the flying wing in the 1940s. A flying wing is the most efficient aerodynamic shape possible. It has no heavy fuselage, no dragging tail. But Jack Northrop failed because without computers, a flying wing is inherently unstable. It wants to flip over. It is uncontrollable. But by 1980, computer technology had caught up with the dream. The B-2 would be flown by a digital brain, a fly-by-wire system that made thousands of micro-adjustments every second to keep the plane stable. The pilot wouldn't just fly the plane, he would vote on where it should go, and the computer would execute the motion. This digital stability allowed the engineers to remove the tail. And this was the secret. The vertical tail of an aircraft acts like a massive mirror to radar waves. By removing it, the B-2 became a flat, smooth shape, a shape that had no right angles, a shape that scattered radar waves like water off a duck's back. The construction of the B-2 was the most secretive industrial project since the Manhattan Project. The workers were vetted by the FBI. The parts were manufactured in different factories so that no single supplier knew what they were building. The budget was classified black. Billions of dollars flowed into the program and disappeared. The cost became a scandal in Washington. The price tag for a single B-2 Spirit eventually rose to over $2 billion. It was literally worth more than its weight in gold. Critics in Congress screamed that it was a waste of money. They argued that no plane could be worth that much. They argued that stealth was a myth. But the Soviet spies were not laughing. They were hearing rumors. They were intercepting fragments of data. They knew something was happening in the desert. They frantically tried to upgrade their radars. They built massive over-the-horizon arrays. They tried to tune their sensors to lower frequencies, hoping to catch the ghost. Then came the day of the reveal. November 22, 1988. The U.S. Air Force rolled the B-2 out of the hangar at Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. They invited the press. But they were paranoid. They set up the viewing stands carefully. They only allowed the reporters to see the plane from the front. They kept the rear of the aircraft, the area where the hot engine exhaust was hidden, and the complex trailing edge geometry was located strictly off-limits. When the hangar doors opened, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The plane didn't look like a weapon of war. It looked organic. It looked like a sea creature or a bat. It was smooth, dark, and utterly alien. The photos that emerged from that day landed on the desks of the Soviet general staff like a bomb. They looked at the shape. They ran the math. And their blood ran cold. They realized that their S-300 missiles, which cost millions of rubles apiece, were looking for a target with a radar cross-section of a large bird or a bus. The B-2 Spirit, despite having a wingspan of 172 feet, had the radar cross-section of a large insect, a bumblebee. The Soviet general in the bunker realized his map was useless. His circles of defense were based on detection ranges of 100 miles. Against the B-2, his detection range might be less than 10 miles. By the time his radar operators saw the ghost, the bomb bay doors would already be open. The nuclear weapon would already be falling. The B-2 didn't just defeat the radar, it defeated the geometry of the defense. It created a corridor of invisibility. It could slip between the radar sites like a thief in the night. But the B-2 was not just invisible to radar, it was invisible to heat. The engineers had buried the engines deep inside the wing. They mixed the hot exhaust with cold air before venting it over a heat-absorbing trench on the trailing edge. A Soviet heat-seeking missile, looking for the hot tailpipe of a jet, would see nothing but the cold background of the sky. And it was invisible to the eye. The plane was painted with a special radar-absorbent coating called iron ball paint. It was a dark, matte gray that blended perfectly into the night sky. Even the contrails, the white clouds that form behind jets, were eliminated by a chemical injection system in the exhaust. The B-2 was a hole in the sky. As the Cold War entered its final phase, the existence of the B-2 fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. The Soviet Union could no longer guarantee the safety of its leadership. The bunkers under Moscow were no longer safe. The mobile missile launchers in the Siberian forests were no longer hidden. The B-2 could hunt them all. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 before the B-2 ever dropped a bomb in anger. But military historians argue that the threat of the B-2 helped bankrupt the empire. The Soviets realized that to counter this American ghost, they would have to tear down their entire air defense network and rebuild it from scratch with technology they didn't have and money they couldn't borrow. The B-2 Spirit had won its first war without firing a shot. It had helped to spin the enemy into oblivion, but the critics in Washington were still loud. The Cold War is over, they said. We don't need a $2 billion nuclear bomber to fight insurgents in caves. The B-2 is a relic, a dinosaur. They cut the order. The Air Force wanted 132 planes. Congress gave them 21. It seemed like the B-2 was destined to be a museum piece, a gold-plated curiosity of a bygone era. But history has a way of surprising everyone. The B-2 was not done. In fact, its real work was just beginning. The ghost was about to go to war, And it wasn't going to drop nuclear weapons. It was going to drop something much more precise. It was going to introduce the world to the concept of global strike. The year is 1999. The location is Kosovo. And the B-2 Spirit is taxiing onto the runway at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The crew is strapped in for a mission that will last 30 hours. They are not flying to a nearby base. They are flying from the heart of America to the heart of Europe, dropping their payload and flying home non-stop. The ghost was waking up, and the world was about to see that you cannot hide from a machine that can be anywhere and nowhere at the same time. The mission to Kosovo in 1999 was the crucible that forged the modern legend of the B-2 Spirit. Until that moment, the stealth bomber had been a theoretical weapon, a doomsday machine designed for a nuclear war that never happened. Critics called it a hangar queen too delicate to fly in bad weather, too expensive to risk in a conventional conflict. But on the night of March 24, 1999, the B-2 silenced them all. Taking off from Whiteman Air Force Base in the middle of the Missouri cornfields, two Spirit bombers began a journey that would rewrite the rulebook of air power. They were not deploying to a forward base in Europe. They were flying directly to the target and back a round trip of over 30 hours. This was the birth of global strike. The idea that the United States could reach out and touch any point on Earth from its own soil without asking permission from allies for basing rights. As the B-2s approached Serbian airspace, they faced a formidable enemy. The Serbian air defense network was built on Soviet doctrine and equipped with dangerous SA-3 and SA-6 missiles. These were the same systems that had shot down an F-117 Nighthawk just days earlier, proving that stealth was not a cloak of invincibility, but a game of percentages. The B-2 pilots were flying into a hornet's nest. But unlike the F-117, which relied solely on its shape to deflect radar, the B-2 had another advantage. It flew higher. It flew quieter. And it carried a new weapon that transformed it from a dumb bomber into a sniper rifle. That weapon was the JDAM, the Joint Direct Attack Munition. Before, the JDAM bombers had to see the target to hit it using lasers or cameras, which meant flying lower or waiting for clear weather. The JDAM was different. It was guided by GPS satellites. It didn't care about clouds, smoke, or darkness. It knew the coordinates of the target, and it steered itself through the sky with mathematical certainty. The B-2 was the first aircraft designed to carry the JDAM in mass quantities. On that first night over Belgrade, the B-2s opened their bomb bay doors. But they didn't carpet bomb. They didn't drop a stick of unguided iron to flatten a city block. The rotary launchers spun, releasing 16 individual bombs. Each bomb had a different address. One went for a bridge, one went for a radio tower, one went for an air defense command bunker. 16 targets destroyed in a single pass. The Serbian generals on the ground were baffled. They saw explosions erupting across their capital with pinpoint accuracy, but their radars showed an empty sky. The weather was terrible, with thick cloud cover that should have grounded the NATO Air Force. Yet the bombs kept falling. The B-2 Spirit had decoupled destruction from the weather. The success in Kosovo proved the concept, but the war on terror would test the endurance of the machine and the men who flew it to the breaking point. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the B-2 was called upon to strike the Taliban in Afghanistan. This was a logistical nightmare. Afghanistan is on the other side of the world from Missouri. It is a landlocked fortress surrounded by mountains. To reach it, the B-2s had to fly across the Atlantic, refuel, over the ocean, fly across Europe, refuel again, fly across the Middle East, strike their targets, and then fly all the way to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to land. The missions lasted over 44 hours. It remains the longest combat sortie in the history of aviation. Imagine sitting in a cockpit, the size of a minivan, for 2 days straight, strapped into an ejection seat. The pilots had to take turns sleeping on a cheap lawn chair they unfolded in the narrow crawl space behind the seats. They ate microwave meals. They fought deep vein thrombosis and crushing fatigue. And they did it while flying a $2 billion national asset into hostile territory. During the opening night of Operation Enduring Freedom, the B-2s effectively dismantled the Taliban's air defenses in hours. They dropped bombs on radar sites, airfields, and command caves. The Soviet-built radars in Afghanistan simply never saw them coming. The Taliban fighters accustomed to fighting the Soviets in the 1980s were waiting for the sound of jets or the sight of helicopters. Instead, they were obliterated by silent geometric shapes falling from the stratosphere. The B-2 pilots famously called this kicking down the door. They were the first ones in clearing the path for the older non-stealthy planes like the B-52 and the F-15 to follow. But the most terrifying demonstration of the B-2's power came during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein had spent decades fortifying Baghdad, burying his command centers deep underground and surrounding them with fiber-optic communication networks. He believed he was safe in his bunkers. The U.S. Air Force had a different plan. It was called shock and awe. On the first night of the war, a flight of B-2s approached Baghdad carrying a special payload, the EGBU-28 Bunker Buster. These were 5,000-pound laser-guided drills designed to punch through 30 feet of reinforced concrete before exploding. The B-2s slipped through the Iraqi radar net, which was already degraded but still dangerous. They loitered over the city unseen and unheard. Then they unleashed the heavyweights. The bunker busters slammed into the palaces and command centers of the Iraqi regime. They didn't just damage the buildings, they gutted them from the inside out. The Iraqi leadership was decapitated before they could even issue orders to their troops. The B-2 spirit proved that there was no sanctuary. You could not hide underground. You could not hide behind radar. You could not hide in bad weather. If you were on the list, the spirit would find you. Yet for all its success, the B-2 remained a controversial aircraft. The maintenance required to keep it invisible was staggering. The radar-absorbent skin of the aircraft was fragile. It was sensitive to rain, humidity, and heat. After every flight, crews of technicians had to crawl over the surface inspecting it for microscopic cracks or tape peeling. They had to reapply the exotic radar-absorbing putties and paints, spending dozens of hours of maintenance for every single hour of flight time. The hangars at Whiteman Air Force Base had to be climate-controlled to exacting standards. The B-2 was a diva. It demanded perfection. The critics argued that this fragility made it useless in a sustained war. They said it couldn't generate enough sorties. But the Air Force argued that one B-2 sortie was worth 50 standard sorties. One B-2 could strike 80 separate targets in a single night with GPS precision. To do the same job with conventional F-16s, you would need an entire armada of planes, tankers, jammers, and fighter escorts. The B-2 was a force multiplier. It was efficiency in its deadliest form. This efficiency was highlighted again in 2011 during Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya. The Libyan dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, possessed a surprisingly robust air defense network integrated with Soviet SA-5 missiles and French-made radars. NATO needed to establish a no-fly zone, but they couldn't risk shooting down conventional jets. The call went out to Missouri. 3 B-2 spirits took off on a mission to destroy the entire Libyan Air Force on the ground. They flew across the Atlantic, entered Libyan airspace, and targeted the hardened aircraft shelters at Gardabaia Airfield. In one pass, they dropped 45 JDAMs. Every single bomb hit its target. The shelters were punched open, and the MiG-23s and Su-22s inside were destroyed. The Libyan Air Force ceased to exist in less than a minute. The B-2s turned around and flew home. They had neutralized an entire nation's air power in a single afternoon commute. The invincibility of the B-2 spirit was a carefully cultivated image, but on February 23, 2008, that image was shattered not by a Russian missile, but by the laws of thermodynamics. On a humid morning at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, the Spirit of Kansas was preparing for takeoff. It was a routine rotation mission. The pilots pushed the throttles forward, the 4 General Electric engines roared, and the massive Batwing accelerated down the runway. But as it lifted off, something went terribly wrong. The flight control computer, a brain worth millions of dollars, commanded the plane to pitch up violently. The aircraft stalled. Its left wing dug into the tarmac. The pilots ejected seconds before the $2 billion machine slammed into the ground and erupted in a fireball. It was the most expensive aviation accident in history. The investigation revealed a shocking truth. The crash wasn't caused by enemy sabotage or a major mechanical failure. It was caused by water. A tiny amount of moisture had condensed inside a port transducer unit, a sensor that measures air pressure. This moisture gave the computer false data, making it think the plane was flying faster and lower than it actually was. The computer tried to correct a problem that didn't exist, and in doing so, it destroyed the aircraft. This tragedy highlighted the paradox of the B-2. It was the deadliest machine in the sky, but it was also incredibly fragile. It was a weapon system that could defeat an empire but could be brought down by a few drops of rain. It proved that the complexity of American technology was both its greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. The loss of the Spirit of Kansas reduced the fleet to just 20 aircraft. Suddenly, the B-2 felt like an endangered species. And as the 2010s progressed, the environment it operated in began to change. The monopoly on stealth was ending. The Russian Federation, having recovered from the chaos of the 90s, began to field the S-400 Triumph missile system. The S-400 was designed specifically to hunt stealth aircraft. It used multi-static radars and low-frequency sensors to try and detect the faint resonance of the B-2's airframe. China was not far behind, developing the J-20 stealth fighter and building artificial islands in the Pacific packed with sensors. The concept of anti-access area denial, or A2AD, became the new buzzword in the Pentagon. The safe skies were gone. The Soviet generals who had once feared the B-2 were gone, but a new generation of Russian strategists believed they had found the answer. They argued that stealth was not a cloak of invisibility, but merely a delay mechanism. They believed that with enough computing power and enough radar emitters, they could find the ghost. The B-2 was no longer a surprise. It was a known quantity. Its radar signature was studied. Its flight paths were analyzed. The hunter was at risk of becoming the hunted. To counter this, the U.S. Air Force didn't just upgrade the B-2, they decided to replace it. They launched the program that would become the B-21 Raider. If the B-2 was the spirit of the Cold War, the B-21 is the spirit of the digital age. While it looks superficially like the B-2, it is smaller, darker, and designed with an open architecture system that allows it to be upgraded as easily as a smartphone. The B-2 was built to carry massive nuclear payloads to Moscow. The B-21 is built to penetrate the dense electronic jungle of the South China Sea. It is designed to be an airborne data node, a flying hacker that can jam enemy radars, control swarms of drones, and launch missiles that have not even been invented yet. The B-2 Spirit, however, refuses to go gently into the night. It is currently undergoing the most massive modernization in its history. New defensive management systems allow it to detect enemy radar emissions and plot a course around them automatically. New communications gear allows it to talk to the F-35 and the F-22, sharing target data in real time. The B-2 has evolved from a lone wolf into the quarterback of a stealth team. As we look back at the legacy of the B-2 Spirit, it is impossible to overstate its impact on the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviets spent decades building a defense based on the idea that they could see the enemy. They built walls of radar and mountains of missiles. The B-2 rendered that investment worthless. It forced the Soviets into an economic arms race they could not win. They tried to build their own stealth bombers, they tried to build better radars, but they ran out of money before they could solve the physics. The B-2 didn't just threaten to drop bombs on the Kremlin, it dropped a financial bomb on the Soviet economy. The psychological impact was even deeper. The B-2 proved that American technology had reached a level that was indistinguishable from magic. To a Soviet conscript manning a radar station in Siberia, the idea of a plane that was as wide as a football field but invisible to his scope was terrifying. It broke the will to fight. It proved that the West wasn't just richer, it was smarter. The Libyan mission showcased the unique geopolitical value of the B-2. It allowed the United States to intervene in a conflict, decisively, without a massive buildup of troops, without parking aircraft carriers off the coast, and without putting hundreds of pilots at risk. It was the ultimate big stick of diplomacy. The mere movement of B-2 bombers to a forward base like Guam is often enough to change the behavior of nations like North Korea or China. It is a signal that says, we can reach you and you cannot stop us. Today, the 20 surviving B-2s are kept in pristine condition, ready to fly at a moment's notice. They are the ultimate insurance policy. When tensions rise in North Korea or Iran, the B-2s fly. They don't always drop bombs. Sometimes they just fly close enough to be seen on a local radar for a split second, just to remind the dictator of the day that the ghost is watching. The era of the B-2 is slowly drawing to a close. In the coming decade, the B-21 Raider will take its place on the tarmac at Whiteman Air Force Base. The old Spirits will likely be retired, their sensitive coatings stripped, their avionics removed, and their airframes sent to museums or the boneyard. But the legend will remain. The B-2 Spirit was the machine that closed the book on the 20th century. It was the pinnacle of the jet age and the dawn of the stealth age. For the pilots who flew it, the experience was almost spiritual. They described the feeling of flying at 50,000 feet at night in a plane that makes no noise on the radio and casts no shadow on the radar. They talk about looking down at the lights of hostile cities, knowing they could extinguish them in an instant, and knowing that the people below have no idea they are there. It is a god-like power. And for 30 years, that power kept the peace by promising the ultimate destruction. The Soviet radars are rusting now. The S-300s are being used in ground wars they were never designed for. But the B-2 is still up there, a black boomerang against the stars, a reminder that in the game of nuclear poker, the United States holds the ace of spades. The ghost is real, and it is still the master of the night.